Scott, we're going to wait for some people to get in here first. There's no point in going nuts starting a live stream unless people are there. So we're just going to
want to do the try and do the intro music a cappella.
Actually, I might have it. Let's see. This works.
You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
This is where Scott does his a cappella impression of the Crimson Cast. Did you just do that on your end?
No.
Nope. Okay, sorry. It ran twice. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. That's not what that sounds like at all. Anyway, all right, guys. Let's get going.
I'm not on Straight No Chaser.
That's exactly right. No, welcome to an emergency live podcast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you here as we've got candy striped smoke coming out of Memorial Stadium after one of the most rapidly paced coaching searches I can ever remember Indiana University doing. IU's apparently got their man. The news coming out earlier today from Pete Thamel, actually about maybe 40 minutes ago, that Indiana is finalizing an agreement to hire James Madison head coach Curt Cignetti. No terms yet. We don't have any of those things, but one thing you learn about the media business after a while, when that starts to break, it all goes immediately afterwards. You can pretty much bank on it. And in fact, we've got Zach Osterman of the Indy Star confirming it. We've got some other folks confirming it. So we're going to talk about it as much as we can. First of all, thanks to all you folks for joining us either live or afterwards. And if you've got comments, please go ahead and include them in you can send it to us on Twitter, you can send it on YouTube, or we're on Twitch as well. So Scott, let's get going here. When we got the news that Tom Allen was being let go, one of the things that we talked about was the things that Indiana needed to be thinking about as far as their next hire. And what you see here with this hire is a different direction than I think both of us initially thought Indiana was going to go. But this is a really, really fascinating direction for Indiana, and one that I have got a lot of interest in. Scott, can you hear me at all? I know this is the perils of live radio, folks. Oh, we just lost Scott altogether. He's going to come back in a second. Anyway, I'll continue to intro. What we talked about before was this idea of IU needing some Power 5 experience, IU needing somebody who could really get people excited and build the program. We didn't have Curt Cignetti on that initial list of people, but this is why coaching searches sometimes take a different direction than you think that they will, because you never know exactly who's out there in the mix. We're going to try to get Scott in here again. Scott, can you hear me now? We can't hear you. So Scott's going to continue to – no, there you are. There you are.
Yep.
Okay, we're back. So let's talk about Curt Cignetti first and foremost. Curt Cignetti, for those of you who aren't aware, a lifetime record overall as a head coach, a 119-35, which is pretty darn impressive. Now that's spread over a bunch of different levels, starting at IUP, the other Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Division II. He was 53-17 there, and really was kind of continuing on the family business there as a head coach. Decided in 2017 to move to Elon. And coach the Phoenix. That is a smaller school in the realm of Division I FCS, and did some amazing things in very short order. Got Elon to 2 NCAA tournaments, then moved to James Madison, a much more established program, and an established program that was looking to make a move up to the FBS level, and that's what they did. And with Curt Cignetti as their head coach, they went 14-2, 7-1, and 12-2 from 2019 to 2021. And then the last 2 years, 8-3, and then 11-1. We just lost Scott again. Hopefully we'll be able to get him back here shortly as he's having some technical issues. Cignetti with a fascinating background. Prior to becoming a head coach at IUP, he was Nick Saban's recruiting coordinator as his the first staff basically that he hired at Alabama, and recruited a ton of really fascinating and high-level players. Mark Ingram recruited Donta Hightower. Before that, he was at North Carolina State, where he infamously coached Phillip Rivers during that stretch of time when they beat Indiana a couple of times. Many of us remember those games quite well. Scott, I was not this guy was not really on my radar that much. Frankly, the more I've read about him, the more juiced I am about this hire. What's your overall take on things?
Can you hear me all right? Sorry, I've had weird technical. It's going over the ocean from Hawaii. I like you, man. Well, I didn't have a radar. I kind of waited to see where the hot boards came up with. I just got to say, his time at Indiana University before, where he went 53-17 and 33-11 in the Pennsylvania State Athletic Conference. I forgot about that, but those are great records. I'll take that all day long. I joke. He was at IU, Pennsylvania. No, I'm with you. The more I read about it, the more he does kind of fit the profile. You go in these searches and everybody kind of ends up kind of finding their one target where it's like, oh, that's, on the hot board, like that's the guy I think would be perfect. And he checks all of, my boxes. This was not up there, but the more I read about him, the more I look at it, he has a system, he has a program, he has a history of winning, at Elon and then James Madison. He went from Division II to Division I, or whatever they're calling the playoff, the football playoff. But most teams struggle. That team went 19-4 in its first 2 years in Division I, albeit in the Sun Belt, but you're still moving up a level. The only thing that would be the concern at the top front would be maybe his age, 62, 63. But I do, maybe I'm just trying to be positive. I do couch that with everything at IU football is kind of a 4 or 5 year window anyway. I know I joked earlier about, if you hire a young coach, they're good, they're going to leave. And it's like, that doesn't happen. But it's like, we haven't had a lot of people like, well, this is our next guy for 30 years. Like that hasn't happened a lot. So, if he can come in and get the ship going in the right direction and get it 5 or 6 years, that's fantastic. So I'm pretty fired up. And what I like too is the early results I've been poking around on, this is still fresh on college football Reddit. A lot of the James Madison fans are like, damn it. Like, damn it. Which to me, like, that's always a good sign versus it's very concerning when, you hire someone and the other team is like, have fun with that. Like, yeah.
Right. Well, you brought up a lot of good points. I mean, the things, look, I'll caveat by saying this. No one knows anything. Indiana's won press conferences before in terms of who they've hired. Yeah. Everybody loved Archie Miller. Everybody thought that was a surefire hire on the basketball side. That didn't work out. So, look, what's fascinating to me is, yes, everybody loves this hire. That I've seen. There's been a couple of IU fans who are like, who is this guy? But the vast majority of people, particularly people that really pay attention to football, have been fired up. National media seems to be like, wow, that's not something that we expected Indiana to do. People from fan bases of other schools are like, wow, that's an impressive hire. So,
to be fair, national media with Indiana football is like, we weren't expecting them to have a team next year. Anyway,
that's right. Yeah, no, there's something to be said for that. But, a lot of the idea of why would you fire Tom Allen? You couldn't possibly get anybody better to come coach at Indiana. This is a guy who, at least on paper, while he doesn't have, perhaps the bona fide FBS level long time experience, this is a guy who is a winner. He's a program builder. He's a guy who has helped to successfully pilot a program transitioning from FCS to FBS. And not just that, like, did it at a level that had national media chiding the NCAA for not breaking their rules to allow James Madison to go play in a bowl this year, because there's a 2-year probation on programs rising up a level. Like, when you look at the success that he's had at all these different stops, my thought has always been, when you look at the people who can coach IU football and the specific issues that IU football has that we've talked about so many times, the idea that it's felt like since Mallory left, Indiana has lacked an idea of what it is as an identity to be a good football program, to win. They've gone through a series of coaches that have either not built that or have struggled to build it or have allowed it to dissipate on them. This guy seems like the type of guy who has done that at every place he's been. And, will it work at the Big Ten level? Only time will tell. But I'd like to remind everybody, and I tried to do this a little bit on Twitter last night, you just don't get a lot of like considerably experienced Power Five coaches coming in and coaching Big Ten schools regardless. I mean, go through and look at the coaching hires. I mean, outside of Matt Rule, Brett Bielema, and Greg Schiano, who was a special case because he had nowhere else to go but back to Rutgers. It's all, coordinators at that level, or it's group of five coaches. It's promotions from within. It's not a situation where you've got a bunch of people jumping that have had a huge amount of success at the Power Five level. Even Jonathan Smith, who everybody has uniformly praised as like a great hire, that's a guy that's got a losing record career-wise at Oregon State. And, it's Oregon State, so you give him a little bit of an asterisk there. But my point is, this feels like a very different type of hire from what Indiana would normally have been able to pull off. They didn't go the MAC route. They didn't go the coordinator route. They went with a guy who's been a program builder in a bunch of different places. And that is going to be really fascinating to see how it plays out. And I think that's why I'm excited about it. He's an older coach, 62 years old, as you said. I'm not worried about that. Indiana, as we've talked about for many years, needs someone to come in, reestablish what Mallory had established here, which, my God, that was 35 years ago at this point. A culture of here's how you win games, here's how you act as a team. From my perspective, like, he's probably looking at this and saying, this is maybe the destination that I am aiming for. I'm not probably at the age where a Power Five school that's higher up in the echelon is going to take a shot on me, but I could build something here that could be my legacy. And that's a really interesting thing. And look, the performance just in general has been fascinating out of his teams, especially at James Madison. He's got a tremendously young coaching staff. I mean, his offensive coordinator is like in his early 30s. His defensive coordinator, I believe, is a younger guy as well. Seems to be recruiting really well and understands how football recruiting at that level has to operate. I mean, you don't serve as Nick Saban's recruiting coordinator unless you know what you're doing. And he's been around college football royalty, not just Saban, who he knew from when Saban coached with his dad at West Virginia, but he also knows Bobby Bowden. Bobby Bowden, like, that was the guy, his dad, who was the West Virginia head coach in the late 70s. That's the guy that he took over for, because Bowden left West Virginia in the mid 70s and went to Florida State. His, Kurt Cignetti's dad, Frank Cignetti Sr., I think, was the guy that took over that program. The reason why Cignetti was an assistant at North Carolina State was because Chuck Amato, who was one of Bowden's most trusted assistants, was the head coach at North Carolina State. So this is a guy steeped in college football tradition. And as Patrick points out, the Sun Belt is not the Big Ten. FCS is not the Big Ten. And I think those are all really legitimate concerns. I think, though, every coach that Indiana was looking at that was in this particular echelon was going to have some question marks around them. We talked about guys like Tom Herman. I mean, nobody knew if Tom Herman had just flamed out and wasn't going to be somebody that could continue to do it at this level or could win at a place like Indiana. We talked about, Paul Chryst, who a lot of people weren't excited about the way that his tenure at Wisconsin ended. A lot of people thought he'd lost whatever fastball he had. So I think whoever the head coach hire was going to be here was going to be somebody that people could say, well, that's not really a home run hire. There's questions about that. There's going to be questions about everybody. Of all of those options, as I've read through all of them and really considered them, this feels like as sure of a bet as you're going to get, knowing that there are no sure bets. A lot of it's going to come down to what Indiana is going to do to make Kurt Cignetti's time in Bloomington successful. And we've already seen a little bit of that. We saw that announcement that came out. It wasn't an announcement, but the Indy Star had it about the NIL fund, like $3 million additional dollars of NIL money coming in for football specifically. That's huge. We've seen some additional investment in football. We saw, the Wilkinson family investing in the new weight room. It's going to be fascinating to see what Cignetti's contract details are, not just for him, but for his assistant coaches. This is a part of an investment in Indiana football. And that's going to be just as important as the hire. It feels like if you can put those pieces around Kurt Cignetti, he's going to know what to do with them, because he's clearly done more with less at lower levels. And that's the kind of person that ultimately you're going to need to coach at Indiana.
agree with all that. The two things that I like is that, he kind of brings a little bit of the best of both worlds, in that when we hired Kevin Wilson, there was a lot of, this is a guy who's been around greatness, like you mentioned with Cignetti. But with Wilson was, he had coached Sam Darnold and had all these connections. Cignetti could go into any recruit and say, look, I've worked with Phillip Rivers, Russell Wilson. I've also got, Julio Jones and Mark Ingram. There's a lot of people under his purvey that he could say. But what he has that Wilson didn't is that, he's also had the ability to build a program, like to be at that top level, as you and I have talked about. That's something you saw with Wilson. A lot of coordinators have a tough time. How do I go from a coordinator to a head coach? And that's something that Cignetti has done. So I love those two things together. The other thing that I was just poking around on, and obviously I can't say I've, watched a ton of film of James Madison the last couple of years, but just looking at their stats, and I fully get Sunbelt is not the Big Ten. So these stats don't quite, apples to apples, but this is also where you need to have a little bit of fun and also a little bit of understanding that, like, you're just, we didn't hire a coach in the Big Ten, so there's not going to be an apples to apples comparison. But you look at, James Madison's quarterback this year, Jordan McLeod. If you took his numbers and just plug them into the Big Ten this season, understanding Sunbelt's different in the Big Ten, he would be second in attempts, first in yards, first in touchdowns, and have a better passing percentage than Tagliavoa, who led the Big Ten in passing.
Tagovailoa.
Yeah. Well, he'll be gone. He's a senior. He'll be gone soon enough. To his brother, we'll call him.
There you go.
But what that tells me is, it does feel like we're going to get a much more dynamic offense in Bloomington. This is a team that threw the ball a lot, threw a lot of yards, had, 32 touchdowns last year, but did it at a very high percentage. Understanding it's the Sun Belt, but, a coach who's 62 has this kind of pedigree. You feel like that he has a system and he's going to come in and work that system. And I think also as fans, like you and I have talked about, obviously we want to win games, but there is a point where I like to be competitive, and I like for the football to be enjoyable to watch. And at least going off of what you've seen him build at James Madison, it looks like we're not going to get a team that's going to just do run up the middle for 3 times, go 3 and out and punt the ball. Like, it feels like we might be getting a more dynamic offense as well, which I'm excited about.
It's from what I've seen, and again, I'm also not an expert on James Madison
or the Sun Belt.
I would actually, I know Taylor at Bite Size Bison is going to have a nice write-up. He's done a little bit already on Twitter about James Madison and Cignetti, and so I would go check that out as soon as possible. But look, what I do know is that it is a more aggressive style. It is a more, like, you look at what he's done at James Madison as far as S&P Plus, which we love if you follow the podcast. What he has done in terms of the respective levels of where the program is at in relation to the rest of the division that they're in. So you can do an apples to apples comparison. I mean, this is a guy whose teams haven't been lower than essentially the top third of the entire division that they're in, whether he's at IU Pennsylvania, Elon, James Madison. I mean, this is a really good James Madison team he's got this year, just based upon the statistics. And again, we don't know if that will translate to the Big Ten, but I think it's got a good chance to. And I think what I love the most about Cignetti, from the little that I've read so far, he places emphasis on the right things. There was a quote that I read about him, saying, like, the key to all of the defensive stuff is like having a strong defensive line, which seems like a small thing, but coming off of multiple years of, I wouldn't necessarily call the 3-3-5 a gimmick defense per se, but this idea of, like, you've got all these extra positions, which I know you were making fun of, which I agreed with a great deal in our last podcast. Everything seemed to be focused on these extras as opposed to the core fundamentals, and he seems to know how to do that. I'm really encouraged by the fact he's got such a young staff. I mean, one of the things you see with older coaches a lot of times is that they really do get locked into either family members being on their staff or people that they've coached with for years. And this seems like a guy who has put together a young, vibrant staff of people who understand football. It's funny, like his offensive coordinator's name is Mike Shanahan. It's not the same Mike Shanahan. They're not related. But this is a guy who played with him at IUP, who's followed along with him, and seems to have grown into a pretty dynamic and interesting offensive coordinator. I mean, people like that this particular head coach seems to bring with him. I like that. I mean, it seems like he's still, to some degree in love with the nuances of the game and figuring out. We'll see what happens. Patrick notes, don't get too far ahead of yourself with family on staff. And I know what he's talking about. His brother just got fired as the OC at Pitt. We'll see what happens with all of that. But by and large, what he's done up to this point, I like the fact that he has not just stuck to his old standbys. He's tried to modernize what he's done to some degree. So,
well, and also that, and all we can do is pull off of little bits and pieces that we've seen. But, I was watching the interview this morning when he was on Pat McAfee, and, it's like, it kind of struck me that, that's something that Tom Allen wouldn't do, or just if he would do it incorrectly somehow. And it was nice to see Cignetti, hold his own on McAfee, kind of have a little bit of teeth toward the NCAA, like have a little bit of, bite, and then, talk about his philosophy and what he's been doing there. And you saw like the spirit there. And again, going back to some of our other hires, that was something that very early on, with Wilson, it was like, man, this guy's he's not an enthusiasm builder. It's like he's right. Doing it his way, and he's kind of off in his own, and you just got to be along for the ride. And then, Tom Allen had his LEO thing, which, it was that kind of approach. It always works if you're winning. The minute you're not winning, it becomes a very kind of grating system that you get kind of tired of. And so I just look at this as like, I do think that for a program that, as you and I have mentioned many times, had really hit an apathy wall and had somehow burned through it and gone even farther into an apathy black hole, I think somebody like Cignetti, from what I've seen, the guy who was on McAfee, it's like that's the kind of guy who could help build some interest and maybe, make IU an interesting place again and be able to do, I don't want to say a lot with a little, because he did a lot at James Madison, but, to get McAfee there and all those things, that's a lot to do at a university like James Madison. It makes me feel like he can help build some of that enthusiasm here, and maybe take little wins and turn them into something a little bit bigger, which is, it's all IU needs.
Yeah, it is. And look, I mean, I feel like to some degree, the Allen era has caused a lot of people to forget that there's a bunch of different ways that you can win football games, and that it is possible to win football games in a consistent manner, being aggressive on both sides of the ball, having a more holistic understanding of what you need to do to win. I mean, it felt like to a large degree, success at IU under Allen was so predicated on the specific things that Allen wanted to do on a game-by-game basis going right. And if they didn't go right, there wasn't really a plan B. And, whether that's fair or unfair, that was the perception. And Allen really only seemed to recruit in one particular area, which was Florida. He really seemed to, and he struggled to develop players. All those things are open questions. The one thing I am kind of curious about with Cignetti is, how does his recruiting work? Right. A, at Indiana. B, I mean, he's not a Florida guy. He's not. I mean, while he's from Pennsylvania and coached at IUP, he's been in the Carolinas or Virginia here in that Piedmont area for the last 8, 9, 10 years. It'll be interesting to see how that transitions. But I do think, given what Cignetti knows, that we know he knows about how programs run, given his pedigree, given his understanding of having been at a place like Alabama, having been at a place like NC State, I right now would feel like this is a guy who is equipped to figure out how to maximize what is at his disposal at a place like Indiana. Now, again, a lot of it comes back to NIL. How is Indiana going to be able to fare in the portal? But this feels like the kind of guy who's going to really engender a lot of excitement from recruits, which was, I'm sorry, it just wasn't there under Tom Allen. As much as people want to blame a lack of NIL dollars or this or that, the reality was, like, by the end, people outside didn't want to come and play for Tom Allen by and large. I mean, you certainly had some people, and some of those people were good, but you know, Indiana didn't get a quarterback that had experience in the portal last year, not because of NIL money, but because nobody wanted to go play in a system where you had already run through multiple starting quarterbacks and none of them could get the job done. You know, that really does make a difference. And that this feels, there was a quote from Mitchell Page, former IU player. The IU football hire feels crazy. Typically, a guy like that goes to a place like Texas or Florida. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, this is a guy with some buzz around him within the community. This is a guy that clearly, you know, I think vibes with players on a level that Allen's LEO culture only kind of partially got there on. And certainly, you know, I'm not trying to denigrate Allen per se, but I'm saying this feels like the type of guy who can engender a lot more excitement among the people that need to come in and play the game, because all you have to do is look at his track record of success up to this point. You know, I mean, everybody heard about James Madison this year. You know, that you can walk into a living room or walk into a conference room with a potential player and say, look what we did in a very short period of time at a place that was fighting as much of an uphill battle as Indiana is fighting. That's going to be exciting. And I think if he can marry that to a system that maximizes people's talents, you know, that's something that I'm really intrigued to see what happens.
Well, I go back to, you know, it's somebody who has head coaching experience, who has experience building programs, and it feels like he's unlike some of the other names that were on that list. You know, where they were either assistants or it would have been a first-time head coach, or, you know, I feel like this is really, it goes back to something we talked about at the end of our season pod, that, you know, for as bad as the season has been, as unhappy as we've been, there are pieces there. Like Sorsby has looked good. McCulley looks like a good wide receiver. Like there is a world where I'm immediately, as a fan, already excited for next year, because, like, man, if Cignetti comes in and he knows what he's doing and he can come in he just has that feel of a guy. He's like, all right, I'm going to come in on Friday and here's my plan. Like, here's what we got to do. Like, we're going to start doing this. It does feel like you have a quarterback who might be able to do what you need to do already there. And you might have a quarterback wide receiver combo that's there. It's like some of the pieces are already there. And then, you know, if you can maybe bring a couple of the guys from James Madison, you know, maybe you have a couple guys like, I know Dion's kid and there's other things there, but, you know, you bring some people from a different level. It's like maybe they have what it takes at the Big Ten level that they weren't getting, you know, correctly looked at. You get a little buzz in recruiting, and, you know, it feels like maybe we're not so far away from where we needed to be. So I'm excited about that. I have a question for you. There's a little bit back to the process a little bit. And this is stuff you've kind of talked about on Twitter or some of the discords you've been a part of with other people. You were saying how, you know, that there was some smoke and, like, don't buy into the smoke, but yet, and you know, IU was trying to keep it tight-lipped, but it did feel like Cignetti was out there early, and it felt like this was the way it was going as of last night and this morning. Are you surprised that it was not as tight-lipped as maybe you were expecting, or is it just there was already there's already a list, and it's like that's who it was, you know, you can only keep so much tight-lipped?
Well, I think most of the details were done when stuff started to leak out yesterday. But I think it's important to note, like, go back and look at those job boards. Go back and look at the names that were getting mentioned. I don't remember Curt Cignetti being on most of them, if any of them. It was Jason Candle from Toledo. It was Mike Hart. It was Justin Fry. It was Christ, I think it is. Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, Christ would be an interesting choice. He, I'm not, but no, you know, Cignetti's name didn't really fully pop up, and certainly didn't pop up as a central candidate until yesterday. I mean, I think Scott Dolson did a really good job, as he did with the Woodson hire, of keeping this under wraps and using some really good misdirection, so that really people didn't know. I mean, we heard more about Cignetti and tied with the Duke job than we heard about him being tied with the Indiana job. And so I look at it and I say, this was a good job by Dolson of keeping this under wraps. And as E-Rock says on Monday, I didn't think Cignetti, was even a possibility. I thought he was too good. You know, you'll get people who will put names out, but I'm talking about reporters, you know, people who, supposedly have sources that didn't really have this as a notion. And so again, I think Indiana, oftentimes people think they know what's going on. Indiana does a really good job of keeping things under wraps, and they do a really good job of misdirecting people. And this is the type of coach, and I think, people have talked about Willie Fritz as a possibility. People have talked about a couple of others. This was a more realistic option in terms of culture, because I don't know how many coaches that are in the South were really planning on coming up to the North. But people, I think, looked at this and said that's the profile of a coach. If he's going to go anywhere, was going to go somewhere else, was going to go to a bigger program, a program that had more bona fides from a football perspective. Obviously, still some interesting things to keep in mind. I was asked by Mark Cady to address whether he'll come here quickly for portal additions or stay at James Madison for the bowl game. I mean, clearly, it's important for Indiana to get somebody in place. I do think that it is possible, theoretically, to come handle portal business, get things going, and still potentially coach in a bowl game, but it's not ideal. I mean, people forget Kalen DeBoer stuck around through that cycle, coached in the Gator Bowl, and then went to Fresno State. It wasn't like he jumped ship immediately. I don't know what's going to happen with this. I would prefer to see him in town and doing IU's business. But as much as I would prefer to see that, I don't think it's 100% deal breaker. In my mind, like I don't think Indiana is going to be that far behind the 8 ball moving forward if he doesn't leave James Madison immediately. But it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But no, look, I think overall Indiana did a good job of keeping the coaching search under wraps. I think they deserve a lot of credit for wrapping this up so quickly. I mean, what is it?
Fucking 4 days.
The news broke through agent sources at 1:00 on Thursday, and that's quite a short time period, given that we didn't get news about Tom Allen being fired until 9:00 on Sunday. I mean, you're talking about less than 4 full days, or less than 5 full days. My math is bad. Look, obviously, I think it's funny. I remember when the announcement came out either Sunday night or Monday that IU had engaged a search firm. There were legitimately people that thought
just hired,
IU had just hired the search firm, and it's like, we got to be smarter than this, people. Like the idea that IU hadn't. The idea that IU woke, Scott Dolson woke up on Saturday or Sunday and was like, I'm going to fire Tom Allen. We're going to start from scratch. Like, that's not how this stuff works. IU
put a to-do on my list for Monday to hire a search firm, but after lunch. We'll get to that later. Yeah.
The idea that IU hadn't done a lot of due diligence ahead of time, identified the 2 or 3 candidates they really thought were going to be worthwhile. And, what we heard in the reporting that I trust on this is that IU would really put a premium on head coach experience. And this guy absolutely checked that box in a slightly different way than we thought. But he clearly checked that box. I wanted to get to a question from Chad Schwarzkopf. I don't claim to be an expert in college football, but I'm good at digging beyond his age. Not much negative to find, not to harsh the vibe, but what are some negatives you guys see? So, I mean, look, I think the obvious ones we talked about a little bit earlier. You just don't know if a guy at the lower reaches of FBS or the FCS level is going to translate up to this level. I actually think many times they do. I mentioned, I was talking about this with Jared over at Assembly Call on text yesterday. I get a lot of Kalen DeBoer vibes off of this type of a hire. And keep in mind, like, DeBoer was a head coach at the D3 level, had been kind of rattled around in the lower reaches of college football for most of his 30s and early 40s. He gets the job at Fresno State as an offensive coordinator. Then he goes to Indiana, which is not exactly a destination spot within college football historically. Then goes back to Fresno State. Then he gets the shot at Washington after 2 years. But that wasn't a guy, if you looked at his pedigree initially, that you would have been like, wow, that's a great head coach whose stuff is going to translate. There's always the possibility that could be an issue. We talked earlier, due to his background in college football and the lineage between the Bowden and Saban trees, I'm not too worried about him because I think he knows what it looks like, but you never know. We still don't know what Indiana's structure is going to be around Cignetti from a contract perspective, from an assistant pool perspective. We've heard a little bit on the NIL front, and that is certainly positive. that could be a real obstacle. And look, ultimately, a lot of it comes down to how does he adapt to a place where there isn't a real focus on football culture. And I think one of the things you look at his time at Elon, who does not have a great historical football culture. I think you can mitigate some of those concerns through looking at that kind of thing. But again, I think the biggest concerns on the part of the person that you hire is how well do they translate and how do they handle now being in a position where you're near or at the bottom of the pecking order. You're in a state that doesn't have a lot of innate football talent, and the stuff that the people that it does have always go elsewhere. But I think you would have that question with any of the candidates. And as far as track record stuff is concerned, I feel really good about the track record here. And again, as we heard earlier, this just seems like the type of person who generally has just never considered IU because IU hasn't been in, like they haven't considered them or they haven't been in the running for them.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you're Indiana football, you're never going to have just the perfect hottest candidate out there. There's always going to be issues, and I hear that, and it's like that is. I've always been fascinated with coaches. I always use Archie as an example. Like it should have worked. Like he should have been able to make the leap up. It didn't. Totally different discussion. But it's like coaches who go from one level to the next level. It really seems to be. There's really not a lot. Like it's hard to figure out what makes that work and what makes it doesn't. But to the comment, about like he has no higher level experience. Like, well, look at the coaching board. Like a lot of the guys, it's not like we had 12 options on there with guys who had experience. There was not Christ, but Christ. Paul Christ has some experience at Wisconsin. I'm going through the list. You had Dan Mullen, who was quickly off the list, or didn't seem to get any traction, but he had some experience in Mississippi State and Florida. But everyone else was, and I guess Jack, Dickert at Washington State. Everyone else was either an assistant or had kind of lower, whether it's Tulane or Toledo, you're kind of at that next level. It's not like guys who are at Mississippi State are looking to come here, leave SEC schools to come to the Big Ten. So you're going to have to give somewhere. You mentioned the contract. I am curious to see what they do with the contract, what the buyout looks like. And I think at this point you're kind of beholden to agents. You're kind of beholden to what the market will bear. And I would just urge people, I think people are obviously a little bit, burned by the last buyout, but all I would say is two things. First off, as I've said many times, they have a nice TV contract. IU will be just fine. Like they have donors, like everyone's going to be fine. And for the most part, it's not your money. The second thing is if you see a contract with a sizable buyout for a 3 to 4 year period, I know it might suck in 3 to 4 years if things don't work out, but it's like you have to remember at this moment, that is the price of playing ball with the big boys. And that is what all the other big boy teams do. And I'm not trying to, talk it away or justify it, but it's just like if you want to suddenly be, hey, we don't want to get burned with another buyout. Well, guess what? You're not going to get a high level coach. You're just not. Look at Texas A&M. I guarantee they just pay the Jimbo buyout. I guarantee their new coach's contract is going to have a huge effing buyout for the first 3 to 4 years also.
Well, I mean, look, as I was talking about the other day, Frank Reich just got fired by Carolina after 11 games. Nobody talked about his buyout. And you could say, well, that's not college, that's pro. I keep telling you folks, college football is pro football. It's just a different level of pro football. This is where things are at. And look, they signed a big buyout with Allen. We've talked about the circumstances of that. A big buyout. Look, I just love the fact that IU has shown that they're going to financially invest in a football program. Think about the amount of money that Indiana will have spent here on football specifically over the last 6 months. And that includes the $15.5 million that they're going to give Tom Allen to walk away. So look, I'm really fascinated by how all of this rolls moving forward. Couple other things I wanted to mention before
you think Rod Carey at some point goes in the office is like, so that 2-year deal that I got, like I know Scott, I know you're busy. I know you got a lot of stuff going on. That was guaranteed, right? Just making sure, like, I know you haven't paid out everybody yet, but Carey might be the biggest winner here.
Yeah, I know. Well, well, it's funny. It will be interesting. You look at it, I'm curious who Cignetti brings with him as opposed to who he brings in from elsewhere as far as his staff. And we don't know. I think all these things, it's almost pointless to speculate. Again, I'll go back to what I said at the beginning of the podcast. I'm impressed at how young his staff is. You look at his coaching staff, there's only one person on his coaching staff that graduated from college earlier than 2000, and that person graduated in 1999. And he's got some people from the state of Indiana currently on his staff. Pat Kuntz, who was Notre Dame guy, played for the Colts for a little bit, is the D-line coach. Bryant Haynes is the linebackers coach and the D coordinator. He's a Ball State guy. So look, all that I'm sure will be revealed. I feel like I trust this guy to know who to put in positions, and we'll see what he says in the initial press conference and what comes up afterwards. But it's a fascinating change of pace for IU to be grabbing this type of a coach and, someone who has chosen to go to Indiana. Because look, again, this is a guy who he could have probably had the Duke job without a whole lot of problem. Would have made a natural fit. He coached at Elon, which is just down the road from Durham, knows the area well. Duke's a lower pressure job that obviously you can win at, whether it's Mike Elko or David Cutcliffe. So to choose to go to Indiana, to me, is really fascinating because I think it represents that Indiana has decided to make a sizable investment in football, and that has impressed this guy enough that he wants to come to IU. But it also, I think, is impressive that Indiana, looking at their football program, when it would have been a lot more financially expedient to say, this sucks, we don't like the direction that it's going, but we're gonna eat it for another year, we'll pay less next year, and then we'll figure it out. Not only did they say, no, that's not good enough, then they went out and got an incredibly hot coaching commodity, a guy who's been a head coach, albeit not at the top levels, but has won everywhere he's been, has built programs at places that are not easy to build programs where he's been. That feels like the type of guy that Indiana would want to have as their head football coach. And to me, that's where right now I'm excited. And again, I'll say what I said at the beginning of the show. We don't know how this will go. Indiana, winning the press conference at Indiana is not the same as winning football games at Indiana. And we all have seen that in other sports. But if you're going to go off of what we can react to right now, which is who the person is that they hired, what they've done, and how well we think that will mesh here, having followed IU football for as long as I have, Scott, I think you feel the same way. This feels like the type of profile that can work here. And it's very different from the profiles that we've seen among some of the more recent people that have been hired here.
Agreed. I mean, I think you and I are similar with the search committee. I wanted somebody who had some head coaching experience because that's been the profile that has worked at Indiana. It's a little lower level than what I was expecting. But, you're right. And I'm always taking a step back. And it's like, in the end, none of this matters. I'll know in 3 years. Like, we'll all know in 3 to 4 years if this worked. That's kind of the dumb answer. But I will say that, unlike any other time except for maybe out of the DiNardo era, the apathy thing had gotten so low that we're at a point where winning the press conference actually I does think matter a little bit here just to get enthusiasm up. So, the fact the fact that he comes in, he has a little bit of street credit, the fact that most of the national media is like, whoa, that's a nice hire. Like, good job by Indiana. Like, you're getting a little bit of a pat in the back from the way that he seems. We'll see it seems like the press conference is going to have a little bit of juice, a little bit of energy. Like, I think all of those things are actually important at this point in time because apathy had gotten so bad that you need someone to come in, like again, Wilson was an interesting hire, but he wasn't really a rah-rah guy. So it's like, I think some of that is needed now.
First of all, thanks to Xander Diamant, who just retweeted our live stream here. Xander, we miss you. Thank you so much.
What's up, man? I was just making a clip art for my phone of him smoking the cigar. So Xander, if you're listening,
tremendous.
That's going to be my new sticker for the next couple of weeks.
Tremendous. Jack Siegel had a great comment earlier that fits right in with what you just said. There needs to be a full rebrand for 2024 with Cignetti. This should figuratively and literally feel like a new era. And I think you're right. I mean, obviously, we're going to hedge our bets a little because you don't know until the rubber hits the road. But it is important, not just that Indiana win the press conference nationally, but that Indiana gets people excited about Indiana football. I mean, you and I have followed this program for so long. It was so gratifying to watch the excitement around Indiana football in 2019, 2020, the lead up to 2021.
Yep.
And it was so disappointing and gutting and frustrating to watch it go away so quickly. It just was like, wait, what? Come back. Where are you going? Like, what happened? It felt like
I want to live in the Iowa
we
tailgate the rest of my life, like the tailgate before the Iowa game. Like that moment was great. Go ahead.
I know it was absolutely gutting if you really cared about IU football to watch IU football go from a spot where it was the feel good story of the college football world. Everybody loved what was happening in Bloomington to winning 3 Big Ten games total over a 3-year span, and to watch IU fans just essentially give up again and say, oh, well, back to the old way of doing business. And you're right. I mean, like, Kevin Wilson was, he was almost like a technocrat in a way. Kevin Wilson did a lot of really good things to build the pieces that made IU football relevant in the Big Ten, but he was just not the type of guy that was going to go get people fired up. Now, we'll see how Cignetti handles being in the press conference and how he handles working with fans. I think it was one of the big concerns people had with Paul Chryst. Chris' track record looked good, but everybody was like, that's boring. I mean, Wisconsin's fans' nickname for him is Coach Dad, which isn't really the vibe I think Indiana wanted to get. And while, Tom Allen, as you mentioned, certainly could get people fired up about the idea of IU football, he could not deliver the results. And eventually the rah-rah stuff just felt really hollow. And it almost felt like it was almost a slap in the face to some degree for fans who were like, Coach, we get it, LEO, please show us something that would allow us to believe. And it just was never forthcoming. And so all of this stuff is important. Indiana has to be a program that attracts donor interest. And that's where Scott Dolson has to come in and really fundraise off the back of this and help to elevate what Indiana's doing. But fans have to get excited again. People will do this. I mean, the thing that drives me nuts, I remember that Cincinnati game in 2021 when, the infamous McFadden targeting game.
Right.
The stands were packed. Students were there, and students kept showing up that year, the next year, just waiting for something to get excited about, and it never materialized. And by the middle of this year, everybody was gone. It's going to take some time to build that back up. It's going to take some results, but it feels like the pedigree, the overall, the profile that this coach hire brings in could help to energize things. And I think in this new era of college football, it becomes more and more important that Indiana do that. Indiana just can't afford anymore to treat football like an afterthought. And I don't think that they have in terms of trying to put some of the structures in place. I think that a lot of what's happened over the last 3 years has been an erosion of trust between IU and the donor base and Allen, and a lot of reasons for that occurring, which really are outside the purview of this particular episode of the podcast. Maybe we'll talk about it in the future. But as Chad mentioned, watch the video of Chad Cignetti on College Game Day. He'll do great in the press conference. I think you're right, and I'm really excited to see how that goes. Indiana fans deserve something to get excited about. This is a great example of something to get excited about, and I, for one, am excited. I didn't think I was going to be excited. I was expecting to kind of have to hold my powder on this and be like, well, we'll see. We're going to support the new coach. We'll give them time. But at the end of the day, a lot of work's got to be done to rebuild this roster. You got to make decisions on who you're going to try to get back out of the portal. You got to make decisions about who you're going to bring in from outside. Obviously, like we had a question from Ethan McCartney about, you want DMAC or Swersby returning. It's one of those things where at the end of it all, there needs to be a complete reconfiguration in how IU football thinks about its roster. And I think having a fresh perspective come in and look at all these players and make decisions about how we want to play and where this is going, that's the really important thing right now.
Well, we talk about enthusiasm. His Cignetti's, his time on game day, his time on McAfee. It's like, I'm not sure any other coach that we've had could have done that. And again, it's one point of reference, but I think back to like the very, very weird reference, but the movie Private Parts about Howard Stern, where like he gets on to NBC in New York, and like it's like him and like this stuffy old news guy, and it's like that guy can't handle on this set. Like Cignetti was able to do it. Like that's where it's like his age. He doesn't act like his age. He didn't look like a 62-year-old guy out there. When you talk about enthusiasm, just the other thing that I will hit, something you've mentioned before, but I will kind of re-mention here. The schedule is very advantageous next year. You look at our schedule, getting into it, you're going to start the season with FIU and Western Illinois at home. Assuming we're going to be better than last year, which I hope so with a new coach, you could be 2-0 going into the UCLA game, which is a road game. Fine, you're 2-1. You come back for Charlotte and Maryland. You could, Maryland has the quarterback that I can't mention, but we'll have a new quarterback, somebody new, no longer Tua's younger brother will be there. Who knows what's going to happen with them? You could be 4-1 going into that game at Northwestern. Northwestern is going to have a new coach. Who knows what's going to happen with them? You could be, I'm very rosy colored glass here, but I don't think it's out of the realm. If you get a little bit better, you beat Maryland, who fell off a cliff this year after they beat us. You beat Northwestern. You could be 5-1 coming home to host Nebraska and Washington back to back. That's going to, with a new coach and a 5, that's some excitement where it's like, hey man, it's October 19th against Nebraska. And we're planning to go to a bowl. Again, I'm taking the glasses half full side of all this, but I don't think looking at, FIU, Western Illinois, Charlotte, Maryland, and Northwestern, I don't think winning all of those is out of the realm of possibility. Even if you're 4-2. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, it's a great runway. It's a great runway for a new coach, which I have to think played into the idea of, if you're going to make a change, do it now. You got 8 home games. You've got a winnable road game at UCLA. This is really, obviously you got to rebuild both lines a bit more. Taylor did a great job on Bite Size Bison of laying out the most important people in the portal, and most of them are linemen. That's where Indiana, this is where NIL comes in, but it's also where a vision from the head coach is going to be really important. And that's got to happen right away. And Scott, they just officially announced it. The graphic is up. IU just announced Cignetti officially as the head coach. Like all we had was the unofficial stuff.
Did they go with sources? Did they go with sources say IU?
They did not go with sources, no. Anyway, we've gone almost an hour here, so I think we're going to wrap up. Let's get final thoughts from you before we wrap things up here.
No, everything, it would all be a recap of what we said. I think this is, I think it's a really good hire. It feels like we've won the press conference, even the press conference hasn't happened yet. You're always going to be excited with a new coach just because, they at this point, everything is perfect and everything could be the best possible outcome. It's probably not going to turn out this way. This is still a roster that, won one Big Ten game this year and really struggled to beat Akron, had some issues. But as you and I both saw, it's not one of the most talent, direct rosters I've seen in my lifetime watching IU football. Like I watched this team, it's like there's some pieces there. It did feel like it was a little bit mismanaged, and so I'm excited. I'm happy. I like everything I've heard. But now, as you said before, now the rubber hits the road. How is it going to engage the portal? How are we going to do with transfers? I don't think you have to tell IU fans to have some patience because normally there's a little bit of patience there. But I would say just, let's wait and see how it goes. And, I think a great first step, all I'll say to Cignetti is a great first step is let's name a starting quarterback going into that FIU game. That would be a great way to start this offseason is just be like, hey, I have a vision of one quarterback who's going to lead our team. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's a good day for IU, and I'm thrilled. I think overall, you look at all of the factors, all the variables. This feels like as good as Indiana was going to do in this cycle, and I think any team that hired this guy was going to probably feel the same way, and that's exciting for Indiana to be in that spot.
Sorry, the last thing I'll say is it does feel like for the first time in continuing this process, it does feel like IU is treating football like one of the big boys. Like they went and they fired the coach, they paid their buyout, and then they went out and they got one of the hotter coaches in the realm that IU was able to get. We're obviously not going to, steal Jimbo Fisher or somebody away, but it's like we got, for our level, we got probably the best, hottest coach we're going to be able to get. And so it felt like we really didn't take the cheap route or the simple route, or like, hey, no knock on like a Mike Hart or something. Like, we're just going to take the guy with connections and kind of sneak out. It's like, it felt like we treated this like, hey, what's a real national search? Let's get the best guy we can possibly get, spend the most, and do it right. So it feels like we're continuing to take football seriously, which I like.
And look, we've said it before, Indiana is not like other programs. There's a real foundation that has to be rebuilt at IU that hasn't been there for a while now. And you want somebody who's capable of doing that. And this is why, no disrespect to a Mike Hart or a Justin Fry or some of those kind of up-and-coming assistants, I just don't think Indiana was in the position to hire somebody like that. They need someone who's been a head coach. They need someone who's run a program. They need someone who's been connected to successful programs at other places in the country, who can bring that perspective and bring that focus on winning. This is a crucial time for IU football, and I'm excited that this is the direction they're going. I'm not going to claim that this was the guy I wanted from the beginning, but the more I've looked into it, the more I'm excited about what we're seeing. And I'm looking forward to seeing him in the first press conference and seeing what he does the rest of the day. Anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Scott, I appreciate you hopping on.
I appreciate you, man. Go enjoy Hawaii, man.
We're on vacation. We're going to go ahead and do that for a little bit. Anyway, thanks to all you folks for watching. Really appreciate it. We'll be back next week. We'll have some more content as we recap what's going on with this hire. We'll have plenty to talk about, I'm sure, by that point. So anyway, for Scott, I'm Galen. Thanks to Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor. Be sure to tune in to the rest of the shows on the Back Home Network as we cover IU basketball, both men's and women's. And we continue to cover the new era of IU football. And congratulations to head coach Curt Cignetti, the next coach of Indiana University football. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.